all sorts of statutes of limitation have run since then.
All right, are we ready to start?
Archdeacon?
I think so. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to all of you and to our guest speaker, Father Ted Pulcini, as we begin our Sunday evening series. This series is the latest effort by our adult education ministry at St. Nicholas, as we try to provide a mix of programs throughout the year for the continuing education of all of us in the faith. So I want to thank you for your support and your participation in this and in all of our programs. These programs are a vital part of our church life, because as Orthodox Christians, we view life as a learning experience in a way, a learning experience in which we learn all the time more about how to grow closer to God so that we may participate ever more fully in the abundant life that we're called to as Christians. And with that purpose in mind and in that spirit, we're very excited to welcome Father Ted as our guest educator for this series, a series about rising to the challenge and living as a Christian in difficult times. I know that he will teach us many meaningful things as he addresses these issues by taking us deeply into the prayer of St. Ephrem, prayer we say very often during Great Lent, and applying those lessons from that prayer to our lives in ways we have not thought about before. When you introduce someone, it's a little unusual, I guess, to talk about yourself. But if you bear with me for just a minute, Father Ted alluded to this. I first met Father Ted as an undergrad just over 40 years ago. He was a fellow Western Pennsylvanian, a graduate student at Notre Dame studying theology by way of Harvard College, where he did his undergraduate work and where he graduated with highest honors. I did not spend a lot of time with Father Ted then, but in the short time that we did spend together, he taught me some things, showed me some things about the Orthodox faith that I had been raised in. Those things made a lasting impression on me. And over the years, as I've shared those things with others, I think they have found meaning in them as well. Father Ted went on from Notre Dame to the seminary and to receive a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh in religious studies, and to serve churches in California, in Cleveland, Ohio, and in Massachusetts. He came to Grand Rapids, as you just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, I think 25 or 30 years ago, to serve and to offer a retreat. And once again, he taught me some things about the faith by the time that I was raising my own children in the faith and developing more. And I have shared those things with others and with my children since then. And I believe, again, they've had an impact on them and in their life in the church. Father Ted went on to become a professor, a very popular and widely published professor at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania. And he was instrumental in the founding of a church that he pastored for many years until his very recent retirement, St. Mary's in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Tonight, we welcome Father Ted again to our community in the midst of so many challenges that we face today. Challenges that we respond to, I believe, by seeking to learn more about our faith and what it teaches us about how to live. Father Ted's lessons, again, I can attest from my own experience, are good lessons. And I know that we will all learn things in this series that will make a lasting impression on us and those who we share them with now and forever as we rise to the challenge of living an Orthodox Christian life in difficult times. So please join me in welcoming Father Ted back to our community of St. Nicholas here in Grand Rapids. Father Ted.
Thank you, Brother Deacon. It's wonderful to be here. I have to say that I always consider it a privilege and an honor to be invited to speak. Why? Because it forces me to take stock of what I need to learn and what I am learning. Please don't think that I come here as a geronta or as a starets. Anyone who knows me well knows that that's not who I am. but I am with the rest of you a fellow struggler. And that means that there are lessons we all need to learn to continue to grow in the faith. Whenever difficult times come, there's a tendency of all of us to say, why is God doing this? How can he allow this? What benefit can come of this? Well, I have to say that this pandemic experience that we're all going through has been so tragic in so many ways to so many people, and I don't ever want to overlook that. But I have to tell you, there are some very valuable lessons that this struggle has taught me, and I hope is teaching you, teaching us all together to weather this storm of difficult times, to deepen our faith. Without difficulties, our faith continues to be an inch deep and a mile wide. That kind of faith cannot survive. The faith has to be expansive, it's true, but it also has to go deep. And whenever difficulties come, that's when the challenges arise that enable us to achieve that kind of breadth, to contemplate the depth that our faith is now experiencing. So I come to you today to offer some experiences that I've had recently. These past 9 months have been very difficult for all of us. And I have to say, for me, coupled with my retirement, all right, it's given me a lot of time and space to reflect on the truths of the Orthodox faith. And what really makes it true and beneficial is that it transforms our lives if we understand the resources that it brings to us. So difficulties bring challenges, challenges bring struggle, and struggle brings spiritual growth. And that's what we're here for. Let me ask 2 questions. First of all, can all of you see on your screens the PowerPoint presentation I'm going to use? You can? Okay. Can you see me?
Yes,
All right.
we can.
And what are our time constraints? How long are we scheduled to go tonight? Brother Michael?
Think about an hour, so 8-ish, so.
Okay. So let me talk at you for a while, and I'll make my presentation, and then we'll break for questions and discussion. Sound good? Okay. All right. So St. Isaac the Syrian said something that I came across recently, and it is related to what we're talking about here. A reward is bestowed for a conflict, and no one speaks of a victory where there is no struggle. So the fact that we're going through a struggle now enables us to emerge from this with a victory if we confront the challenges in a way that is conducive to spiritual growth. St. Isaac of Nineveh was an East Syriac bishop. He lived in the 7th century, and he's known for his ascetical writings. But the same idea is also taught by a modern day saint, and that's St. John Maximovich, the wonder worker of Shanghai and San Francisco. And he died in 1966 in Seattle, and he said this: until a man's earthly life finishes its course, up to the very departure of the soul from the body, the struggle between sin and righteousness continues within him. The struggle of those 2 forces is constantly at work. I want to use that basic thought and give it a vocabulary that I'm going to follow in my presentations now. That struggle between sin and righteousness might also be described as the struggle between vice and virtue. And that's the dichotomy, that's the opposition I want to focus on in this talk and in the talks in the 3 weeks to follow. This struggle between vice and virtue is described in a book that many of you I know are familiar with. You've seen it. I don't know whether you've read it, but it's worth a read, called Unseen Warfare. And it's a classic of Orthodox spiritual guidance, edited by St. Nicodemus, the Hagiorite of the Holy Mountain, and revised by St. Theophan the Recluse. Now, this is a great book, and I want to tell you why. Get out of your mind the kind of biased, bigoted kind of view that a lot of Orthodox have, that we have nothing to learn from the West. East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. This idea that everything Eastern is good and everything Western is a waste of time in Christianity, that's just utter nonsense. And this work, Unseen Warfare, which has become a classic of Orthodox spiritual life, is a good example of that, because we attribute it and rightly so, the version we have to St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, who died in 1809. But this work of his, Auratos Polemos, Unseen Warfare, is based on a work that was written by an Italian Catholic priest, Lorenzo Scupolo, who died in 1610. The book in Italian, of course, it was written in Italian, was Combattimento Spirituale, Spiritual Combat. And it was first published in 1589. Now, Lorenzo Scupolo was a priest of the Theatine order of the Catholic Church. I don't know anything about the Theatines, except that's the order he came from. And there's something about his life that remains a mystery. He was laicized in 1585, and all the lives say, for violating the rule of the Theatine order. What exactly he did that got him laicized is a matter of speculation. I don't know. But he was laicized in 1585, and 4 years later, in 1589, he published this work, Combattimento Spirituale. In other words, he was a recluse when he was laicized, and he wrote this reflective, deep, perceptive work about spiritual growth. And he later enlarged it in various ways. This work from the 16th century was read by St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. He translated the work of Scupoli into Greek because he said, this is an amazing piece of work. And yes, it came from the West, but there's so much in it that we as Orthodox can learn. He took that work, Combattimento Spirituale, combined it with some of the shorter works of Scupoli, and he put together the work Auratos Polemos, Unseen Warfare. Now, he didn't just translate it, he, of course, adjusted it. Whenever he saw something that was not orthodox, that needed to be corrected, he corrected it. But those revisions were relatively minor, and he based his work basically on the work of Scupoli. Into Greek, he translated it. But of course, the Russians cannot be left out. So St. Theophan the Recluse brought the work to Russia in the 19th century, and he orthodoxized it a little bit more. He was even a little more critical of some of the parts than Nicodemus was, but it spread in the Russian church as well. The Russians really grabbed hold of it, and it became a classic that has been honored among them ever since. And the basic point, as I said earlier, and I want to stress again, is he sees the spiritual life, Scupoli does, and then Theophan the Recluse and Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain agreed with this dichotomy between vice and virtue, and saw this as a hopeful and helpful way for having people take stock of their spiritual life in an Orthodox context. This is not an idea, of course, introduced by Scupoli. It's in the New Testament. This text, Philippians 4:8, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever modest, whatsoever just, whatsoever holy, whatsoever lovely, whatsoever good thing. And this is the phrase I want to focus on. If there be any virtue, and the word in Greek for virtue is arete, if there be any virtue, if any praise of discipline, think on those things. By the way, if you ever teach in a college and they want to have a religious reading for baccalaureate, this is usually what they take because it can be digested by everyone. You know, it's talking about whatever is true, whatever is modest, just, holy, lovely, and so forth. If there be any virtue, and that's what Philippians, St. Paul writing to the church of Philippi says is the heart of Christian life, cultivating the virtue. Those are the things that are true, modest, just, holy, good. That's what virtue is, and that's why we should pursue it. So I want to go a little bit more. The word in Greek, as I said, for virtue is arete. The Latin word that translates the Greek arete is virtus, from which our English word virtue comes from. Now, if you took any Latin, I don't know, do people still take Latin in high school or college? I hope so. But virtus is based on the word for a man, a human being, vir. And so here's what I wanted to say, the relation to theological anthropology. That's a fancy way of saying this. I have to use the fancy words because it makes me feel important, but I'll tell you it's a very simple idea. Theological anthropology is nothing more than a highfalutin way of saying to understand what a human being really is, all right? To understand what makes us really human. If you have any Jewish friends and you've heard Yiddish and they'll say that guy is a real mensch, if you've heard this, mensch is just the word in Yiddish for meaning he's a person, he's a human being. He's someone who has good character. And that's what virtue is. Virtue is the characteristic of a real human being. Someone who is a mensch, someone who's a good human being, has these characteristics that we come to call the manly virtues. And that has nothing to do with, sex and man versus female. The human virtues are the things that virtues mark as a true human being. Now, that means virtue is related to ethics. And there are all these ways of understanding ethics. I'll tell you, I don't like ethics as an intellectual discipline. My definition of ethics, I was going to say don't quote me, but I think I'm being taped, so it's too late. My definition of ethics is an elaborate intellectual exercise to justify what you wanted to do in the first place. And this is something that has really made a debate arise about what ethics being taught should be. There are two ways that you were probably taught about if you ever took an ethics course in college. One is being ethical means obeying the rules, fulfilling your duty to obey the rules. That's called the deontological approach. If you are dutiful and you obey the rules, you're ethical. It seems to me like a very narrow and boring way to understand ethics. The other way is what most of us have absorbed in our culture. And that's the idea is an ethical judgment is based on the consequences of actions. That's called consequentialism, or sometimes teleological. In other words, look at what the results of something are, and that'll tell you whether it's ethical or not. That strikes me as dishonest on a lot of people's parts, that they tend to exaggerate the positive outcome of what they want to see as ethical and emphasize the negative outcome of what they see as something that they don't want to consider ethical. It's not always an honest exercise. So both the deontological and the consequentialist views, I think, are not as important as the third view. And that's called virtue ethics, eritological ethics. In other words, you judge something on the basis of the character of the actor. If the actor has good character, if the actor is a man or a woman of virtue, chances are their actions are going to be virtuous. And that is something that I think is a much better gauge of ethics. I heard an apocryphal story that at St. Vlad's Seminary years ago, Father Alexander Schmemann said when they were trying to set the curriculum at St. Vlad's, do we really need a course in ethics? Because for us Orthodox, ethics is not about intellectual analysis. It's about living our life formed in the character that Orthodoxy wants to form us at. In other words, there's a relation between virtue and spirituality. Ethics is nothing more than a function of spirituality. I have to say, this is where my heart is. And that's what I'm going to follow in this talk that I'm giving and the three others. In other words, what virtue makes an ethical person. And that's why the distinction between virtue and vice is so important. If you want to live a good spiritual life, you have to cultivate the virtues and root out the vices. And why? Because Orthodoxy calls the vices as characteristics of the passions in our life. These passions are appetites and impulses that we have, and they can cause a lot of problems. Some people think that those appetites and impulses are intrinsically evil and need to be rooted out completely. St. John Climacus, St. John of Damascus both feel that way. They see passions as something, a sort of an unnatural, intrinsically evil invasion of human beings. The other stance is this, that basically the appetites and the impulses are good, but they become disordered. To be hungry is an appetite. It's good. If you don't have that appetite, you'll starve to death. But if you become a glutton by doing nothing but eat, this is a disordering of a good appetite. I don't think the appetites or the impulses, the passions are intrinsically evil, but both camps, both those who think it's intrinsically evil and those who think they're intrinsically good but disordered, agree on this. They cause problems. And those problems are the vices. And so at the very least, we have to train the passions so as not to take vices. And that means this. We have to diagnose our spiritual condition and discern what it is that we're struggling with, what our virtues and our vices are. When you go to a doctor and you're sick, he does a diagnosis. Well, and this is the important point and what relates us to the pandemic. The precondition, a prerequisite of good spiritual discernment is solitude. Solitude. Having to be alone, to be disconnected, to have time and space to yourself where you're not constantly being drawn out of yourself into all kinds of activities that distract you. You need to be able to have this time alone. Why? Because solitude eliminates interference, and there's nothing but in a lot of our life. Let me tell you, I would not have made it through the pandemic thus far had it not been for Netflix. Because Netflix is constantly providing some kind of interference that I need when I'm starting to feel too reflective about what's going on inside me spiritually. There have been a lot of works coming out recently in psychological literature about the psychology of solitude, and I'm going to look at a couple passages here that are sort of interesting because they are directly related to the insights of a lot of the ascetics, the spiritual writers in the Orthodox tradition. Much of that study shows that there is a necessity of solitude for people to be healthy psychologically, and certainly to be healthy spiritually. Now, I want to make this point. Solitude I'm using here, it's not to be understood only as being alone. Because some of you are saying, Father, what are you talking about? Solitude. I wish I could have solitude during this pandemic. The kids are at home all the time. My spouse is at home all the time. I constantly have people around. I don't have any time for solitude. Being in solitude does not necessarily mean being physically alone. It means being detached from the usual relational attachments. For instance, a lot of people are working from home. They are interacting with people all the time by Zoom, by email, by internet. It's not that they're isolated and not communicating with people, but the usual relational attachments they would have if they were in the office on a daily basis, they don't have, even though they're constantly in communication with others. So solitude in its basic meaning means being alone physically, but I'm using solitude being understood in a way that it's not just being physically alone, but detached from all the attachments that attract us on a day-to-day basis. Just to have a couple of these quotes from modern psychological studies. One author says this: our unconscious requires solitude to process and unravel problems, so much so that our body imposes it upon us each night in the form of sleep. By the way, in teaching in college, I can tell you the biggest cause of problems for the students that I saw is when they were sleep deprived, when they didn't have that solitude that comes, it's built into life through sleep. By removing us from constraints, distractions, and influences imposed upon us by others, solitude frees us to reconnect with ourselves. There's the crucial point: to reconnect with ourselves, to assimilate ideas, and to generate identity and meaning. So solitude is a spiritual necessity. It's also a psychological one. Another article says social isolation does not necessarily cause loneliness, while isolation is the objective state of being alone. Loneliness is the subjective experience of disconnection, which means that you can feel lonely when surrounded by people or connected while by yourself. Amid COVID-19, most of us are more isolated, yet that doesn't mean we are lonelier. And this is an important distinction to keep in mind. And yet we tend to be afraid of solitude. Just a few basic things here. I found these interesting. This one author says, given the choice between solitude, being alone, and receiving electric shocks for 15 minutes, believe it or not, many chose the electric shocks rather than being in solitude. We can probably recognize that some of our fear about being alone is not unique to the current pandemic. It's a fear that has lurked in us for years. Have we forgotten, or perhaps have never really learned? Here it is: how to sit with ourselves, including with our uncomfortable thoughts and emotions. I had a friend who was a Roman Catholic nun whose order required them once every 7 years to take an extended retreat, a month-long retreat. Some of the nuns would take it by themselves. They'd rent a cabin and be in isolation for a month. I remember when she told me this, I said, wow, this is great. I would love to do this. And she says, it's great for the first day. It's great for the second day. The third day, you begin to get antsy. And by the fourth day, you say, I have 26 days left and I'm absolutely terrified because I have no television, I have no one else to talk to, and you have to turn and look at yourself. That's why the Desert Fathers went to the desert. If you've ever been at a desert, you realize what a desert takes away is all the sensual stimuli that draw us out of ourselves. When there are no birds chirping, no buildings around you, no animals running by, all there is endless sand and silence. You have nowhere to turn but into yourself and to recognize what's going on inside you. Solitude brings a self-examination that changes you, and it's terrifying to go through. And I dare say that the pandemic in various contexts has forced us to engage in solitude in a way that terrifies a lot of people. There are so many people now who are really psychologically distressed because they're terrified by the solitude that they have, either the physical solitude of being in isolation from others or being detached from a lot of the attachments that otherwise would keep them occupied. Most of us are afraid to be alone with ourselves because getting to know ourselves is a very fearsome process. And that's what the fathers learned, and that's why they went to the desert. And when we do find ourselves alone, we're increasingly at a mercy of an attention economy that bombards us with ever-present, ever-pleasant distractions. Those of you who have kids, take away their phones for a week. You take away your phone for a week. You know, I didn't have a smartphone until about a year ago. I was online every day, but when I left my office, I went home and I didn't have connection with anything else. I had to wait till the next day to answer emails. Well, when I got the phone, it's always by my side. It's always right here. When I'm watching television, every time I hear a ping, it's, oh my God, who's that? I'm constantly distracted by that now. And I had to put that aside during this pandemic. If I'm going to be in solitude, I'm going to make that solitude work for me spiritually. All right? So, lest you think this is only something that is a modern obsession, not so. Here's Evagrius the Solitary, who died in 399. He's writing in the 4th century, and he says this: sit down and recall in solitude the things that have happened, where you started and where you went, in what place you were seized by the spirit of unchastity, dejection, or anger, and how it all happened. Examine these things closely and commit them to memory so that you will then be ready to expose the demon when he next approaches you. That's by someone writing in the 4th century. This was quoted in an article written in March 2020, because the same thing is in effect here. Now, besides solitude, monaxia, we need stillness as well. And the two of them have to be covered. We talk a lot in Orthodoxy about hesychasm, but we don't realize that hesychasm is based on Hezekiah, this stillness. Besides these, the virtues of the soul, there are bodily virtues, or rather the tools or instruments of virtue. And he lists some of these as solitude, preserving stillness, being still, don't doing everything. By the way, what is the enviable quality of people? We say, oh, that guy is so good. He's always multitasking. It's not enough for us to be constantly doing things, but we have to be doing multiple things. This is the absolute opposite of stillness. And that's why we have so much spiritual and psychological disorder. Abba Philemon and Gregory of Sinai see the same link between solitude and stillness. He says, those in solitude practice blessed stillness. The two of them have to be linked one to the other. There are ways to create this kind of stillness: unceasing prayer, the Jesus prayer, the study of the scriptures, where the soul's noetic eyes are opened and they see the King of the celestial powers. Great joy and fierce longing burn intensely in the soul. And those who practice solitude practice blessed stillness, because the whole spiritual focus comes as a result. The pandemic has forced us to retract ourselves from a lot of our busyness. It has forced us to be alone in ways either physically or emotionally from others. We have an opportunity for spiritual growth because of solitude, monaxia, and stillness, Hezekiah. The pandemic and all of the tragedies that has brought us these gifts that can genuinely lead to good spiritual development. Nothing fills the heart with contrition and humbles the soul as solitude embraced with self-awareness and utter silence, stillness. Brings us to this prayer of Saint Ephrem, the Syrian. And what I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk and in the talks to follow is I'm taking that prayer and we're going to look each week at one virtue and one vice that he talks about. And luckily, nicely for this series, there are 4 virtues and 4 vices. So each week I'm going to take one virtue and one vice. Saint Ephrem the Syrian also lived in the 4th century. He's called the harp of the spirit. I love that because he has a poetic soul and a spiritual discernment that has made him famous throughout the centuries. By the way, he was a deacon. He was a Syrian Christian. He spoke Syriac as his first language. And I have to tell you, Syriac is preserved as a written language, but it's dying out. Many of you are aware, except for a few villages in Syria and Lebanon. And I have to say this, as a Harvard grad, I'm very pleased with this. When in Harvard, they said that spoken Syriac is beginning to fade away, they took some of their beaucoup money and they actually invested in a research project where they sent students, usually graduate students, to these villages and had the people just talk into a microphone. They recorded the talk of the Syriac speakers so that when this language gets left behind in history, they still have records of it as a spoken language. One of those villages, by the way, how many of you have heard of Ma'alula? It's an Orthodox village. This is where the convent is, Ma'alula convent, and this is one of the places that still speaks Syriac. Well, Ephrem the Syrian was a Syriac speaker, and he was born in 306 in modern day Turkey, and he wrote hymns and poems of various things. This is interesting. I found this out in researching. He died in 373, also in Turkey, Edessa, which is modern day Urfa. And you know what he died of? He died of an epidemic that was passing through the population at the time. So I said, aha, this was inspiration to concentrate on Saint Ephrem the Syrian, because he himself struggled with a pandemic, an epidemic in his life. It actually took his life. He died there in Urfa, in Edessa, ministering to his people. And that makes him especially appropriate to discuss during this time of a pandemic. And you all know the prayer of Saint Ephrem. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of 4 vices: sloth, meddling, lust of power, and idle talk. but give rather the spirit of four virtues: chastity, humility, patience, and love to thy servant. Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own sins and not to judge my brother, but are blessed unto ages of ages. Amen. As Archdeacon David stated, we think of this prayer usually in conjunction with the services of Great Lent. But as you all know, and I'm sure you're in a properly penitential spirit, we begin Lent today, the Nativity Fast. And there's no reason that this prayer, which we emphasize in Great Lent, you can see it also is pertinent to this fast. It really is very pertinent. The two things we're going to focus on in my remaining comments are sloth as the vice and chastity as the virtue. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth. Now, sloth is obvious. There's a physical, external aspect to it. The word in Greek is agia, and it's translated as laziness, sloth, idleness, not working. I have to tell you, that word is not used in the New Testament. That specific word, argia. There is another word, nothri, slothful. Remember, St. Paul in 2 Thessalonians says this. He said, if a man does not work, he shall not eat. All right? Because there were a lot of people in early Christianity who said, the second coming is coming right away. All I have to do is eat, drink, and be merry and wait for Christ's imminent return. And that was leading to a lot of abuses. St. Paul says, if you don't work, you don't eat. Sloth is not an acceptable element of Christian lifestyle. And there's another word too that's used in the New Testament, rathimia. So sloth in its external, obvious, physical aspect is condemned in the New Testament. But I want to point this out because this is probably more pertinent to us. Sloth has a psychological internal aspect as well. I love this idea. In Greek, it's called akidia. And it's usually translated as something like listlessness, lethargy, all right? What that means is this. The monks said that they are usually hit by this, no matter how well they start out their day. They're working in the fields, they're working to study. But around noontime, they begin to feel lethargic. They begin to feel they need some rest. When you retire, you can say, now I'm entitled to my nap time, all right? The monks said this, and they said, you know what they equated this with? They equated this with the noonday demon that's mentioned in Psalm 91 or 90 in the Septuagint. You will not fear the plague that destroys at noonday. This plague that destroys at noonday, they said, is this demon of akidia, of laziness, of listlessness that comes over you. I have to tell you, a few years ago, Time magazine did a study of how people's personalities, some people are morning people, some people are evening people. I am a morning person. So my time of the day when I don't do anything that amounts to much is in the afternoon. As I said, once you retire, you can take that as your nap time. But when I was not retired, I still had to work, and I found it very hard. Sloth was something I had to overcome in my psychological internal aspect. And that is one of the vices we all have to struggle again. By the way, one of the ways that it can be translated is unmindfulness. Many of you have heard of the Buddhist emphasis on mindfulness, all right? It's really something that's very much in common, has very much in common with the Orthodox spiritual discipline, that your thoughts become dispersed and you have to focus your thoughts. Mindfulness means you're focused on what you're doing at the time and you're not thinking ahead to what you're doing next or thinking back to what you did before. Let me tell you, I am so unmindful, and I found this out during this pandemic. When I go to sleep at night, I turn the thermostats downstairs down before I go upstairs to go to sleep. Saves a lot of money. So I'm in my usual routine. I'm about to go to sleep. I go and I turn down the thermostats. And as I'm going up the steps, I said to myself, did I turn down the thermostats? I was so unmindful of what I'm doing. I was thinking of other things that right after I did it, I couldn't really remember whether I had done it. It's not because my memory's going, it's because I was not mindful. There is a spiritual internal sloth that I have to overcome. And that really has come home in a big way to me during this pandemic. And by the way, another good translation of this internal psychological aspect of sloth is apathy. All right. Not apathia. Apathia is a Greek term meaning passionlessness. That's good in Orthodox theology. But I'm talking about apathy the way we use it in modern English. We don't care. We don't care. You know, a lot of times in counseling students and they have to decide on a major, I ask them, what are you up to? What do you like? And I say, I don't know. I really don't feel an attachment to anything. In all the courses you've taken, what's grabbed your attention? Nothing much. That's the kind of apathy that sloth as a vice brings on people. And sometimes this leads to depression, which in Greek is called the dejection. What's the virtue? That the prayer of St. Ephraim couples with sloth as the first virtue, chastity, Pulcini. This is not what it usually is. Chastity we usually think of as in sexual terms, not being sexually active, being sexually restrained. That's not what chastity in the pure sense means. Chastity basically means sound-mindedness, being sober. I can't say sobriety because we usually associate sobriety with not drinking. All right. This is a modern usage. Sobriety means being sober-minded, serious-minded. That's what chastity is. Having a balance, a moderation in your thoughts, not being impulsive and acting on impulse all the time, but having a balance and a thoughtfulness, discretion, prudence. This is a virtue that definitely needs to be cultivated these days. It's self-control, non-impulsiveness. And our society, in all the television programming and a lot of literature and a lot of movies, it's like impulsiveness is what we constantly are talking about and in many ways glorifying. Self-control is something that the Bible says is an important part of a man, a mensch, a weir, someone who has virtue. Proverbs says, a man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. Good image. Fourth Maccabees says, for reason is the guide of the virtues, but the emotions, it is sovereign. Observe now, first of all, that rational judgment is sovereign over the emotions by virtue of the restraining power of self-control. Self-control, then, is dominance over the desires. 1 Timothy, for God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power and self-control. Finally, by the way, when I give this, I use this sometimes in talks when I'm talking to priests and if there's a bishop's presence. One of the necessary qualities of a bishop is that he be a hospitable, a lover of goodness, master over himself, upright, holy, and self-controlled, not given to impulsive action or decision making. And finally, how do we get to cultivation of this virtue of chastity as opposed to some of the vices we're talking about? You have to schedule your time. This is something that the pandemic has brought to mind. When you're out of the office and there's no one looking over you all the time, you have to set your own time schedule. And by the way, that is one of the pieces of advice that psychologists give a lot to people suffering from depression as a result of the pandemic, being alone and being detached. Schedule your time. And if you schedule your time, you'll find that a lot of other things fall into place. For instance, be very moderate in what you undertake. Take a gradual approach according to schedule. Start with small advances, and that leads to bigger ones. St. Isaac the Syrian says, a small but always persistent discipline is a great force, for a soft drop falling consistently hollows out a hard rock. So schedule your time and start with small advances and then move on to the bigger things. Do not try to recreate yourself psychologically or spiritually or intellectually in a week. It's not going to happen. And take physical, external things first. By the way, the reason we fast is not because the food that we're fasting from is evil, but because if you start from physical things where you discipline yourself, you can then move to spiritual things. And daily assess the project you make and congratulate yourself for the progress. And when you fall, pick yourself up and don't make the same mistake twice. Be diligent in practice. Seeking opportunities for practicing the virtues. There's a saying in Spanish, hay que practicar las virtudes. It's necessary to practice the virtues. Hay que practicar las virtudes. And that means you have to look for opportunities to practice these virtues and see the difficulties as therapeutic, not as punitive. So what you need to do in all of this is learn that you have to have consistency in practice, taking honest assessment of your progress, and gradually the struggle begins to subside. And you find out that chastity, in the sense of self-control, in the sense of moderation, in the sense of balance, in the sense of dependability, becomes a reality in your life. And you find a real sweetness in that. By the way, I want to end with this. Why should you cultivate a virtue? Because there's this great quote from, I think it's from St. Ambrose. I don't have the source here, but it says, we know from experience that if a man exercises himself in one virtue well and wholeheartedly, he not only learns in advance by this very fact how to exercise himself in another, but as this experience in the first virtue increase, he stimulates to all other virtues and makes them grow and strengthen in himself, for they cannot be divided from one another, as all are raised from the same divine light. Cultivate one virtue, and it becomes so much easier to have the other virtues follow. So cultivate chastity by all of these things that I've talked about, and you find out that the other virtues I'll talk about in coming weeks will come much more easily. By the way, what's the parallel to this? You've heard this 1,000 times. You want to learn foreign languages, learn one other language other than your first language. And then when you want to learn the third language, it's easier than learning the second language. Learning the fourth language is easier than learning the third and the second language. In other words, the more languages you learn, the easier it is to learn other languages. It's the same with the virtues. So in conclusion, a pandemic struggle can be described in terms of this opposition between vices versus virtues. That's what St. Nicodemus of Mount Athos and Theophan the Recluse, and indeed Lorenzo Scupoli, says in Unseen Warfare. And that's one way to think about how we can regulate, calibrate our spiritual life. The pandemic has provided us an opportunity to experience solitude, a necessary precondition for spiritual growth, and stillness, which really has to be coupled with solitude so that solitude just doesn't become meaningless loneliness. Overcoming the vice of sloth by various things, and acquiring the virtue of chastity by various means. How? I would say I'll leave you with this thought. In the pandemic, where a lot of time is now free, you have expanses of time that are unstructured, not externally imposed. One of the first things we have to do in overcoming sloth and cultivating chastity is to decide on a workable schedule where you can move from small things to bigger victories, from external actions to spiritual actions. In other words, scheduling seems to be a central category for spiritual growth in this. And I'll leave you with that. Any questions, comments, things you want to ask about or comment on? Now's the time to do it. Good. So 7:54. So I got in under 8 o'clock.
Beautiful.
Any questions or comments, things that we can discuss?
Well, I have one if no one else does.
Okay, go ahead. Start us out.
So you mentioned that, trying to evaluate, go into the day, anticipate, and then evaluate. A lot of us are prone, when we do evaluation, to drift into this self-criticism that tends to be, I think, not very helpful.
Yes.
How do we stay among the healthy part of that evaluation and not get into the unhealthy part?
Well, that's a good question. And I have to tell you, that's why we all need good spiritual fathers, spiritual directors, because a good spiritual father will not allow you to fall into hyper correctness. This is a big problem in orthodoxy today in general, super correctness or hyper correctness. We all become perfectionists. And by the way, one of the best articles I've ever read, it's a good psychological, spiritual article. It's online because I always recommend it to people, and I found out it's so popular that it's everywhere on the internet. It's called The Perfectionist Script for Self-Defeat. The Perfectionist Script for Self-Defeat. This is a psychological pitfall where perfectionism brings downfall, but it's also a big spiritual problem. People, how many of us, listen, I'll confess to it. How many of us at the beginning of Great Lent, for instance, at the beginning of the Nativity fasting, I'm going to make this I'm going to get up every morning at sunrise and pray, and I'm going to keep the fast strictly. And it usually goes away by the second or third day. And you have to usually say, I'm not going to be perfect. And what this usually means for a lot of people, they say, since I can't do it perfectly, I throw the whole thing out. This is the spiritual pitfall. And this is one of the ways that the evil one undercuts spiritual growth by not letting us recognize the small advances that we make and how those small advances are really the necessary precondition for the big advances, and not to underestimate the importance of those and to be perfectionists. Perfectionism is spiritual and psychological death. People say, but Father, doesn't Christ say, be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect? That's what grace is about. We are perfect in that the grace of God is all perfect. And what's the prayer that's said? And thank God it's said over the head of someone ordained. The grace divine, which heals all that is imperfect. And that's what a priest is not going to be a perfect human being, but he puts himself under the tutelage and under the power of the grace of God, which is perfect. If he does anything well, anything perfectly, it's not just because he's held tight and his own perfectionism enables him to do it. It's that he has, in a disciplined way, put himself under the protection of God's grace. And that's what has to happen to us too. We work out our salvation in fear and trembling, but that doesn't mean we merit our salvation by virtue of what we do. We open ourselves up to the grace of God by working out our salvation in fear and trembling. By opening ourselves up to that grace, then our salvation can be worked. Without God, there is no salvation. And that means that the small things where we make progress have to be recognized as stepping stones to the larger things. So
thank you.
You need a spiritual father that constantly reminds you of that. So,
Father,
yes.
can I ask, I think you may have suggested this. Is there any reason why the vices and virtues are ordered the way they are in the prayer? And is there any consequence to the sequence here in terms of, learning or thinking about these things in a particular order?
Good methodological question, Father. And let me tell you, I'll be just truthful. No, I don't think there's any particular merit in taking sloth and chastity together. I just structured it that way because I want to take one virtue, one vice. But you're talking about in the prayer itself?
Well, I'm talking about a particular hierarchy among the virtues or among the vices, so that if you were to work on one virtue first, it should be this because of its consequence for the others, and is there any particular aspect to the order of the vices in terms of?
Yes, I think so. I think the answer to that question is yes. Look at the vices. If you look at the vices, take from you the spirit of sloth, meddling, lust of power, and idle talk. I think that if you look at those, slothfulness, being lazy, not being applied, not being focused, leads us to meddle in other people's lives. I love the more slothful a person is, it seems like the more time they have to meddle in everyone else's life. And then meddling leads to lust of power. Once you meddle in someone's life, it's a short step to say, now I want to control that other person. Until finally, idle talk, when you can't control people by physical activity, you destroy them with your tongue by destroying so many things. We'll get to that in weeks to come. But I do think there is a progression. I think sloth is the most externally evident of the vices, and meddling, lust of power, and idle talk are less evident. Look at the virtues. Chastity, being balanced is a good place to start. Then you cultivate humility. And humility means you put yourself, as we'll see, in a lowly state. And I'll give some hopeful, helpful hints for how to achieve humility. And humility is the only thing that enables us to achieve patience. Patience is really humility applied, not trying to get the other person to do what you want, when they want, how you want, all right? But patiently, in humility, letting that other person do what they have to do. So chastity, being balanced, paves the way to humility. Humility paves the way to patience. And what's the last virtue that's listed in the prayer? Love, which is the highest of all the virtues. So Archdeacon David, I would say there's no link between the virtue and vice the way I'm dealing with it in these talks. I just arbitrarily took one virtue, one vice. But I do think you're onto something when you look at the way the vices are ordered and the way the virtues are ordered in the prayer. I do think that one starts with a lower order of vice or virtue and then progresses to a higher, gradually higher order of vice or virtue. So yeah, that's a good insight. Any others? Let me ask a question of the